You saved my daughter, and I've been trying to thank you. One sentence, 8 words. And Ethan Cole, a boy who had survived beating, starvation, and years of sleeping on concrete, crumbled, like he'd been shot, not from pain, from something he had never once felt in 18 years of living, being wanted, being searched for, being found. If this story moves you, hit subscribe right now, drop your city in the comments below, so I can see how far this story has traveled, and stay with me until the very end. You will not regret it. The night it happened, nobody was supposed to be watching. It was the kind of storm that makes people pull their curtains tighter and pretend the world outside doesn't exist. Rain came down in heavy diagonal sheets across the old river docks on the south end of the city, the part of town that the tourist maps didn't print, the part where the streetlights had been broken for 3 years and nobody in City Hall had bothered to fix them. The Yellowstone River was running high and black and mean. It had been eating at the banks all week. Ethan Cole was not supposed to be there either. He had picked that particular stretch of dock because it was dry under the overhang of an old loading bay, and because the security guard who sometimes chased him off had stopped showing up 2 weeks ago. Ethan had a cardboard layer beneath him, a wool blanket he'd found behind a Goodwill bin, and half a gas station sandwich sealed in plastic. That was it. That was the whole inventory of his life at 18 years old. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That was one of the skills you learned when you lived on the street, how to go quiet inside your own head. Not peaceful, just empty. Because if you let yourself think too much about what you didn't have, about what had happened to you, about all the beds in all the foster homes that had eventually spat you back out, you started to come apart. And Ethan couldn't afford to come apart. Coming apart was a luxury for people who had someone to put them back together. He was chewing the last of that sandwich when he heard the sound. It wasn't the crash that got him first. It was the scream, high, sharp, female, cut off almost immediately, swallowed by the sound of rain and the horrifying groan of a guardrail giving way. Ethan was on his feet before his brain had finished processing what his ears had heard. He ran to the edge of the dock and looked down. The motorcycle was already mostly underwater, just the back wheel, and part of the frame still visible, dragged sideways by the current. The headlight blinked twice beneath the surface like a dying eye and then went dark. And 20 feet downstream, barely visible in the black water, something was struggling. Something small. Something that was losing the fight. A girl, young, blonde hair splayed out on the surface like she was already gone. Ethan looked left. He looked right. There were 3 people on the far side of the dock. He could see them. 2 men and a woman, all frozen in place, all staring down at the water, with their phones half raised, recording paralyzed, useless. Nobody moved. He didn't make a decision. That's the honest truth of it. There was no moment where Ethan Cole weighed his options and determined that rescue was the right course of action. His body simply went over the railing before his mind could object. The water hit him like a wall of ice. Montana rivers in a storm don't negotiate. The current grabbed him the moment he was under and tried to roll him sideways, and he had to fight just to get his head back above the surface. The cold was so complete, it felt almost like heat, a full-body burn that started at his skin and drove straight to the bone within seconds. He couldn't see her. "Hey!" He shouted it and got a mouthful of river for his trouble. Coughed, twisted around in the current. "Hey, where are you?" Nothing. Then a splash, a weak one, maybe 10 feet to his left. He drove himself towards it, arms pulling hard against water that did not want to let him through. His shoes filled immediately at old canvas sneakers, completely wrong for this, and the drag nearly pulled him under twice. His knuckles cracked against something below the surface, a rock or a piece of submerged debris, and he felt the skin tear open, but he didn't stop. He found her by feel more than sight. His hand hit her shoulder, and he grabbed with the grip of someone who understood on a cellular level what it meant to have nothing and to lose even that. He got her arm, then her collar. Then he had her against his chest, and he was kicking legs burning in the cold, fighting the current sideways toward the bank because going upstream was impossible. She wasn't conscious. She wasn't helping him. She was dead weight and river weight and all the weight of a night that should never have happened. It took 4 minutes to reach the bank. It felt like 4 years. Ethan dragged her onto a muddy slope of concrete and gravel below the dock infrastructure, gasping so hard his vision tunneled. His hands were shaking, everything was shaking. He rolled her to her side the way he'd seen in some half-remembered health class from 3 foster families ago, and she coughed, a wet, convulsive cough that brought up river water, and then she gasped, and her eyes fluttered open. Blue eyes. Even in the dark and the rain, he could see they were startlingly blue. She looked up at him, completely disoriented, shivering violently. "You're okay," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "You're out. You're on the bank. Don't try to move yet." "What?" She coughed again, grabbed his arm with both her hands and held it with the grip that had surprised him. "What happened?" "Your bike went through the guardrail. You were in the water." He was already looking up, calculating. The people on the dock were gone. Of course they were gone. "I need to get you somewhere warm." "Can you sit up?" Yeah, I think so." She sat up slowly, shaking badly. Up close, she was his age, maybe even a little younger, pretty in a hard way, like she'd grown up, knowing the world wasn't soft. She had rings on 4 of her fingers and a small patch of something on her jacket that he couldn't read in the dark. "What's your name?" she asked, staring at him like he was a strange and impossible thing. "Ethan." "Ava." She said it like it was reflex. Then she looked around and up at the dock down the river. Something shifted in her face. "My bike? It's gone. River took it." He paused. "Are you hurt? Anything feel broken?" She was checking herself, running her hands along her ribs, her arms. I don't think so. My shoulder." She winced. "Yeah, my shoulder's wrecked. Probably hit the guardrail on the way over." "Probably." She looked at him again. Looked at his soaked clothes, his cracked shoes, the blanket that had blown off the dock and was now plastered against a pylon downstream. She looked at his hands, the cut one dripping thin blood into the puddle between them. Something moved across her face that wasn't pity exactly, more like recognition. "You were already down here when it happened." It wasn't a question. He didn't bother to lie. "Yeah," she nodded slowly. "Okay. I need to get you to the road. You need an ambulance." "No," the word came out immediately, automatic, like a reflex trained into her. She caught herself, modified it. "I mean, I need to call my dad. He'll send people. He'll just let me use your phone." Ethan looked at her for a beat. "I don't have a phone." She stared at him, not in judgment exactly, more like she was recalibrating something. "Okay," she said again, quieter this time. He helped her up the bank. It was ugly going. She could use her legs, but her shoulder was bad enough that she couldn't reach out for handholds. So he went ahead, and she gripped the back of his jacket with her good hand, and they climbed the way you climb when you have no good options, just the will to get to higher ground. When they reached the road, there was a gas station 3 blocks north. Ethan pointed her toward it and told her she could use the phone inside. "You're coming with me," she said, not a request. "I'm fine. You're bleeding and you're hypothermic, and you just saved my life." She said it flatly, like someone reporting the weather. "You're coming with me." For reasons he couldn't fully articulate, maybe it was the cold, maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was something in the way she said it, like it was just obvious, like it was simply the next thing that happened. He went inside the gas station under the fluorescent lights. She borrowed the cashier's phone and made a call. He heard only her end of it. 3 sentences. "Dad, I'm at the Exxon on 5th and River Road." And then quieter. "I went in, but I'm okay." She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. Whatever was on the other end of that call, Ethan heard the silence change. Heard the specific quality of a man's voice going from asleep to something else entirely. While she was on the phone, the cashier, a tired-looking man in his 50s who'd clearly seen everything and was past being surprised by any of it, looked at Ethan, at his wet clothes, at the cut on his hand, at the way Ethan was trying not to visibly shiver. "Kid, you want a coffee?" Ethan said nothing for a second. The offer caught him wrong somehow. Too simple, too decent. He didn't trust simple, decent things. "How much?" he asked. The man shook his head. "On the house. You look like you just swam this Yellowstone." Something like that. He wrapped both hands around the paper cup and held it without drinking for almost a minute, just letting the heat travel into his palms. He watched Ava on the phone, watched the way she moved, careful with her shoulder, direct with everything else. No hysteria, no tears. Just someone dealing with the situation the way you did when you'd been raised in a world where situations didn't wait for you to be ready. She ended the call and handed the phone back to the cashier. Then she walked over to Ethan and sat down on the bench beside him. They didn't talk for a minute, just sat there in the buzzing quiet of the gas station, two soaking wet teenagers with river mud on their clothes and a strange new gravity between them. "He's coming," she finally said. "Who's he?" She glanced at him sideways. Something in the glance was careful. "My dad." "Okay. His name is Victor." Ethan nodded. It meant nothing to him. She studied his profile. He could feel it even looking straight ahead. "You don't know who I am," she said, and another non-question. "Should I?" A pause. "Most people around here would." "I'm not from around here." "Not really." She seemed to sit with that. "Where are you from?" He thought about how to answer that honestly without opening a door he wasn't ready to open. "Everywhere," he said. "Nowhere." She nodded like that made complete sense to her, and something in him shifted slightly, the smallest, most cautious unclenching. "Why were you at the docks?" she asked. "I sleep there sometimes. The loading bay overhang keeps the rain off." Silence. Then, "How long have you been sleeping at docks?" He looked at her then, direct, making sure she understood he wasn't ashamed and wasn't asking for anything. "On and off since I was 14. More on than off since I aged out of the system last year." She didn't flinch, didn't do the thing where people's faces went soft and helpless and a little bit guilty. She just looked at him steadily and said, "That's a long time to be on your own." "Yeah, you're good at it, though." She gestured vaguely at him, at the coffee, at the fact that they were both alive and sitting upright. "Not everyone would have jumped." "I didn't really think about it." "That's what I mean." The sound of motorcycles reached them before the lights did. Not one, not two. Ethan heard the distinctive overlapping rumble of a large group coming fast from the north. The windows of the gas station lit up in sequence as the headlights swept the parking lot. The sound filled the space the way thunder fills it, total and unavoidable. Ava stood up, squared her good shoulder. The cashier behind the counter had gone very, very still. Ethan stood up too, because something animal in him, something honed by years of knowing when a situation was about to change, told him to get on his feet. The door opened. The man who walked in was not large in the way that barroom fighters are large. He was large the way that a structure is large, like something built to hold weight. He was in his 50s, with silver threading through his dark beard, and a face that had been rearranged by decades of hard living without ever completely losing its original architecture. His leather vest was black and heavy with patches that Ethan couldn't read fast enough, but the largest one, the one that sat across the top, like a crown, read President. His eyes found Ava in a fraction of a second, covered her, cataloged her injuries, and then for just a moment, just one single human moment, the wall came down and something naked and terrified moved across his face. Ava. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and put his hands on both sides of her face. Gently, completely at odds with everything about his size and his presence. "You're okay. Look at me. You're okay." "I'm okay, Dad." Her voice was steady, careful. She was watching him the way you watch someone whose reaction you need to manage. "Shoulders messed up, probably need an x-ray, but I'm standing." He pulled her into him, carefully mindful of the shoulder, and held her for a moment with his eyes closed. Then he opened his eyes, and he looked at Ethan. Ethan had been looked at by a lot of people in his life. Social workers with clipboards, foster parents with tight smiles, security guards with hands already moving to their radios, teachers who'd seen too many kids like him to believe in any of them anymore. He had never been looked at quite like this. It wasn't anger, it wasn't suspicion. It was something more disorienting than both of those things combined, something he couldn't name because he had no reference point for it. "You pulled her out," Victor Ryder said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a sentence laid down between them like something solid. "She needed help," Ethan said. Victor stared at him. The whole gas station was holding its breath. 4 other men had filed in behind him, big leather-vested, watchful, and none of them were moving. "What's your name, son?" The word landed strange. Ethan took a half-second before he answered. "Ethan. Ethan Cole." Victor Ryder nodded slowly. His expression was unreadable in the way that took years to cultivate the face of a man who had learned to keep his strongest reactions below the surface because showing them at the wrong moment in the wrong room could get people killed. Ethan Cole, he said, you're bleeding. Ethan looked down at his hand. He'd almost forgotten. It's fine. Manny, Victor said without looking away from Ethan. One of the men behind him stepped forward and produced a first aid kit from somewhere with the efficiency of long habit. It's really fine, Ethan said. He took a small step back. Not aggressive, just reflex. Victor watched the step, watched what it meant. Ethan could see him reading it. No one here is going to hurt you, Victor said quietly. You understand that? Sure, Ethan said. He didn't understand it. He had no mechanism for understanding it, but he said sure. Ava was watching both of them with that same careful, steady gaze, like someone watching two unfamiliar dogs decide whether to fight or not. Sir, one of the men by the door, low voice, we should move. Hospital for Ava. And maybe a pause, a flicker of something toward Ethan, get the boy somewhere dry. Victor made a small motion with his hand, a motion that clearly meant something specific to the people who knew him, and then he looked at Ethan one more time. You got somewhere to be tonight, Ethan. The truth of it was so absurdly simple that for a second, Ethan almost said it. No, I have nowhere to be. I had nowhere to be before the crash, and I have nowhere to be now. And I have had nowhere to be for 4 years. What he said instead was, I'm good. Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. We're taking Ava to St. Vincent's. If you change your mind. He reached into his vest and produced a card, plain white, just a number. He held it out toward Ethan. Ethan looked at the card, did not immediately take it. Take the card, Ethan, Ava said from beside her father. The first thing she'd said since Victor walked in. Said it like it was just the obvious next step. Said it like she was already somewhat fond of him and somewhat exasperated by him, and they'd known each other for approximately 45 minutes. He took the card. Victor nodded again like something had been settled. Then he turned his hand, moving to Ava's good shoulder, steering her gently toward the door. At the threshold without turning back, Victor Ryder said, What you did tonight, it matters. I want you to know that. And then they were gone. The sound of the motorcycles built and then faded north toward the hospital. The gas station returned to its ordinary fluorescent quiet. Ethan stood holding the card with his cut hand. The cashier let out a long, slow breath, looked at Ethan with an expression that walked the line between sympathy and disbelief. Son, he said, do you know who that was? Ethan looked down at the card, the number. No name. Victor, he said. The cashier shook his head slowly. That's Victor Ryder. Reaper, president of the Montana Hells Angels for 22 years. He paused, making sure it was landing. The most powerful and feared man in this entire state. And that girl, that's his only daughter. Ethan stared at the card. The weight of the night rearranged itself around him. Everything the same but different. The cold still in his bones, the cut still on his hand, the coffee going cold on the bench, but the card in his fingers. The card from the most dangerous man in Montana, who had just looked at him like he was something worth looking at. He stood there alone in the gas station at 2 a.m, soaking wet with nowhere to sleep and nothing to his name. And he made the decision without knowing it was a decision that would split his life into a before and an after to put the card in his pocket instead of leaving it on the bench. That small unconscious act, that one thing, it was the first domino. And by the time he understood what it had set in motion, there would be no going back for anyone, not for Victor, not for Ava, not for the city that had watched Ethan Cole for years and seen absolutely nothing. And not for Ethan himself, a boy who had learned survival and never once been taught what came after. He was about to find out. He lasted exactly one night before the city turned on him. Ethan had gone back to the docks after leaving the gas station. Where else was he going to go? The card was in his pocket and his shoes were still soaking wet, and the sky was starting to go gray at the edges, the way it did just before dawn. He found his blanket still wrapped around the pylon where the current had pushed it, wrung it out the best he could, and lay down on the cardboard that hadn't completely disintegrated in the rain. He didn't sleep. He stared at the underside of the loading bay they overhang and listened to the river settling back into its ordinary voice and thought about blue eyes in fluorescent light and a man who had looked at him like he was something worth looking at. By morning, the city knew, not the whole story, never the whole story. What cities know is always a fragment, always distorted, always filtered through the version that travels fastest. What traveled fastest in this particular city on this particular morning was simple and electric. Victor Ryder's daughter had gone into the river, and some unknown kid had pulled her out, and Reaper himself had gone to the gas station on 5th and River Road looking for the boy. By 9 o'clock, there were sketches, not police sketches. Nobody had called the police. The Hells Angels didn't do things through official channels. What they did instead was faster and more thorough than anything law enforcement could have managed. By 9 in the morning, hand-drawn descriptions of Ethan, tall, blonde, early 20s, cut on his right hand, were pinned to bulletin boards in 3 different neighborhoods. By 10, they were taped inside the windows of businesses that had understandings with the club. By 11, Ethan saw the first one himself. He was standing outside a diner on the south end, trying to decide if he had enough change for coffee, when he looked through the window and saw a man behind the counter holding a piece of paper and talking to 2 leather-vested riders who were leaning across the counter with the particular posture of people asking questions that needed answering. Ethan didn't know what was on the paper. He didn't know it was him. But he knew the way you know things when survival has been your full-time occupation since age 14, that the energy in that room was wrong. He walked, not running. Running draws attention. He just walked, hands in his pockets, head slightly down, moving at the pace of someone going somewhere ordinary. 2 blocks, 3 blocks. He cut through an alley between a laundromat and a shuttered auto parts store, and then stopped and pressed his back against the brick and stood very still. He could hear motorcycles. 3 blocks away, maybe. Moving slowly. Searching slowly. "What did you do?" he whispered to himself. Not out loud, in his chest. The way you talk to yourself when the answer might be too big to handle. He hadn't done anything. He'd jumped in a river. He'd pulled a girl out. He'd taken a card. He'd gone back to sleep on a dock. But the motorcycles were still moving. Still slow. Still looking. He made a decision right there in that alley. He made it fast because that was the only kind of decision that stayed made. He was going to stay out of sight until he understood what was happening. He was going to be invisible, which was something he was actually very good at, because 18 years of being ignored teaches you the craft of disappearance better than any training ever could. The trouble was that the city had changed overnight. He didn't know it yet, but the search had structure. Victor Ryder had divided the South End into sections, the same methodical organization he applied to everything. The quality that had made him president for 22 years, and teams of 2 were working each section in overlapping patterns. They had the sketch. They had the description. They had the knowledge already that the bund had been living rough in the dock area, which meant they were focusing south near the river, near the industrial quarters. Near everywhere, Ethan knew how to hide. He made it through the first day by moving constantly and eating nothing. He had $4.30 in his pocket, and he didn't spend any of it because spending money meant standing still in a visible place, and he wasn't willing to do that yet. By mid-afternoon, he was in the old train yard on the far east side, farther from his usual territory than he liked, but the train yard had a specific geography that worked in his favor. Lots of cover, multiple exits, sight lines in every direction if you knew where to stand. He was crouched behind a disused maintenance shed when he heard 2 riders talking 30 yards away. He went completely still. Controlled his breathing the way you learned to in spaces where noise had consequences. "Victor wants him found before dark," one of them said. "We'll find him. City's not that big." Diesel said he spotted a blonde kid near the 9th Street Bridge an hour ago. Took off when he saw the bikes. A pause. "He's running from us." "Yeah. Kid doesn't know what's waiting for him." The second man made a short sound, not quite a laugh, something more complicated. You're homeless, you see 100 Hells Angels swarming the South End with your picture. What do you think's happening?" "Silence. We find him tonight," the first one said. "Victor's not sleeping until we do." They moved on. Ethan stayed behind the maintenance shed for 11 minutes after the sound of their bikes faded. He counted. Then he stood up slowly, and his legs had gone partially numb from cold and stillness, and he stamped them back to life and stood in the gray afternoon light and processed what he had just heard. Victor wasn't sleeping. Victor was looking for him with the full organizational force of a motorcycle club that had run this city for over 2 decades. And everyone seemed to think that whatever was waiting for Ethan at the end of that search was something he'd want, that the kid didn't know. Ethan knew better than to trust that. In his experience, in the complete and total accumulated experience of his entire life, when powerful people looked for powerless ones, it was never good for the powerless one. Not once, not ever. It didn't matter what the intention sounded like from a distance. What mattered was the reality of standing in front of someone who could end you and having nothing, no family, no lawyer, no address, no history that anyone would bother to check to protect you. He pulled the card from his pocket. Just the number. Plain white. No name. He stared at it for a long time. Then he put it back. He was not going to call. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He was going to find a place to wait this out, and eventually the energy would die down, and eventually the sketches would come off the windows, and eventually he could figure out a plan to get out of this city entirely. Start over somewhere new. He was good at starting over. He'd had practice. That was the plan. It was a reasonable plan. It lasted until the second day when Dale Pruitt recognized him. Dale Pruitt owned a pawn shop on Merchant Street, a narrow, sour-smelling place with iron bars on the windows, and a particular category of clientele who came in after dark with items they needed, moved quickly. Dale was not a man of principle or loyalty. He was a man of angles. And when he saw the sketch taped inside the window of the hardware store next door, and then looked up to see a tall, blonde kid walking past his shop with his head down and a cut healing on his right hand, Dale Pruitt saw an angle so wide and clean, it almost made him smile. He came out of the shop fast, faster than Ethan expected from a man that size. Hey, not loud, sharp, aimed. Blonde kid, hold up. Ethan's head came up. One look at Dale's face, at the calculation in it, at the way his eyes had gone immediately to the card stuck to his own window, and Ethan started moving. He didn't make it far. Dale was fast and he was motivated, and he had the advantage of knowing the layout of his own block. He cut through the gap between his shop and the dry cleaner next door and came out ahead of Ethan and hit him from the side with a shoulder that drove them both into the brick wall of the alley. The impact knocked the air out of Ethan completely. He went down on one knee and Dale's hand closed around his collar before he could recover. Take it easy, Dale said, breathing hard. I'm not going to hurt you. I just need you to stay put for about 20 minutes while I make a call. Let go, Ethan said. He wasn't panicking. He was cold and precise the way he got when the situation required it. Kid, there's a reward. There is no reward. Ethan didn't actually know this, but he said it with complete certainty because certainty was a tool, same as anything else. Dale hesitated, just for a second, just long enough. Ethan brought his elbow back hard into the man's forearm. Not a fight move, a release move. The specific mechanical action of breaking a grip and twisted free and ran. He ran flat out this time, no more pretense of ordinary walking because ordinary was over. He cut left at the alley exit, right at the next corner, through a parking lot, and over a chain-link fence that caught his jacket and tore it at the shoulder. Dale didn't follow far, but he made his call anyway. And 20 minutes later, 3 Hells Angels riders were at Dale's pawn shop, and Dale was giving them everything the alley, the direction Ethan had run. The state of his clothes, the cut on his hand, the look on his face. He looked scared, Dale said, real scared. The rider in front, a man named Crash, who had been with the club for 15 years, looked at Dale for a long moment with an expression that made Dale slightly wish he'd minded his own business. He should be, Dale said, trying to recover some of his confidence. Running from Victor Ryder. He's not running from Victor, Crash said. He doesn't know he should be running toward him. He looked at the other 2 riders. Tell Victor we've got a direction. East side moving toward the rail corridor. He paused. Then he looked back at Dale with something that was not quite a threat and not quite a warning, and landed exactly in the space between them. You put your hands on the boy Victor Ryder is looking for, Crash said quietly. Dale said nothing. Don't be in this neighborhood when I come back through, Crash said. And then they were gone. Ethan didn't know any of this yet. What Ethan knew was that his shoulder was burning, where the fence had caught him, and his knee was bruised from the concrete, and he was now deeper into the east side than he'd intended, and the afternoon light was failing fast. He found a disused space inside an abandoned textile building's second-floor interior room. No windows to the street, and he sat down on the concrete and let himself stop moving for the first time in almost 36 hours. He was exhausted in a way that went past the physical. The kind of tired that accumulated when you'd been running without understanding what you were running from. The not knowing was its own weight. The sketches, the writers, the systematic search, all of it pressing on him without any frame to put it in. He took the card out again, sat with it in his hands. The thing was, and he knew this, had known it since the alley, since the train yard, since the gas station, the thing was that running wasn't working. He was good at hiding, and he was good at moving, and he was good at surviving, but the city wasn't big enough, and the club had too many eyes, and sooner or later the geography would run out. If they wanted to find him, they were going to find him. The only variable was the terms. He could wait until they cornered him, exhausted, injured, no leverage, no choice. Or he could make a move while he still had some agency, while he could still choose the moment and the ground. He turned the card over in his fingers, then he put it back in his pocket without dialing because he still didn't trust it, and he curled onto his side on the concrete with his jacket pulled up over his shoulder. And he did something he hadn't done in a very long time. He thought about what he actually wanted. Not the immediate tactical situation, not the next 6 hours, what he actually wanted. From any of this, from any day that came after this one. The honest answer was so quiet and so simple and so humiliating in its simplicity that he almost couldn't look at it directly. He wanted someone to tell him it was okay to stop running. Just that. Just someone who meant it. He closed his eyes. On the other side of the city, in the private room of a hospital where his daughter had a hairline fracture in her left collarbone and a mild case of hypothermia and absolutely zero interest in lying in bed doing nothing. Victor Ryder sat in a chair by the window and took a call from Crash. East Side, rail corridor. He's moving, but he's tiring. We'll have him by morning. Victor said nothing for a moment. In the bed behind him, Ava was watching him with the particular alertness of someone who'd been told to rest and had decided that was optional. Is he hurt? Victor asked. Pruitt put hands on him. Victor's jaw tightened, very slightly, just the muscle moving. How bad? Shoulder. Nothing major, but he ran hard after. Kid's exhausted, Victor. He's been moving for 2 days straight. He thinks we're going to hurt him, Victor said. It wasn't a question. It had stopped being a question 18 hours ago, when the shape of the situation had become clear to him, when he'd understood that the boy who'd jumped into a freezing river to save a stranger was now burning through whatever reserves he had left to run from the people trying to thank him. Dad! Ava's voice from the bed. He turned. She was sitting up against the pillows, arms crossed the way she sat, when she'd made up her mind about something and was waiting for you to catch up. Find him tonight. We're trying, Ava. I don't mean to have the guys sweep the rail corridor, girl. I mean, you go. She held his gaze. He's not going to stop running because a bunch of strangers on motorcycles box him in. He's going to stop running because he meets someone who gives him a reason to. She paused. You know that? You've known that since you heard what his life looks like. Victor looked at his daughter. Her collarbone cracked, her eyes clear, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who was right and knew it, and he didn't argue. Because she was right. Because he had known it. Because from the moment Crash's first call had come in describing a boy running through alleys and train yards, in abandoned buildings, not toward anything. Just away. Always just away, Victor Ryder had felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Something that went past gratitude. Something that felt uncomfortably and undeniably like recognition. He stood up, picked up his jacket. Get some sleep, he told Ava. Find him first, she said. He walked out. In the corridor, he stopped and called Crash back with 2 words. Stand down. A pause on the other end. Victor. I said stand down, pull everyone back, give me the last location and leave the rest to me. Another pause. Longer, the kind of pause from a man who had ridden with Victor Ryder for 15 years and knew better than to argue but wanted the record to show that he had almost done so. Rail corridor East End, old textile district. Thank you, Crash. He ended the call and walked to his bike. The city was going quiet around him, the way it did in the deep middle of the night, that specific hour when even the restless things got tired. He rode east without hurrying, without the thunder of the group, just one set of headlights moving through dark streets. He was not going to chase the boy. He was going to find him. There was a difference, and it was the only difference that mattered now. Ethan was asleep on the concrete of that abandoned textile building when the sound of a single motorcycle reached him from the street below. Not a group. One. He came awake fast the way he always did, hand reaching reflexively for the rusted pipe he'd picked up 2 days ago and hadn't put down since. He lay still and listened. The engine cut, footsteps on the street, one set, unhurried, then silence. Then a voice from directly below the window opening, not shouting, not threatening, just projecting clearly into the night air. Ethan Cole, my name is Victor Ryder. I know you're in there, and I know you're scared, and I know you don't have any reason in the world to believe me. A pause of time. But I'm going to tell you something true, and then I'm going to sit down on this curb and wait, and you can take as long as you need. Ethan didn't move. You saved my daughter's life, Victor said. And everything I've done since that night, every writer, every sketch, every call, all of it was to find you so I could look you in the face and say thank you. Another pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped, slightly gone quieter and rougher and more real. I know the system failed you. I know no one ever came looking for you before. I know that's exactly why this doesn't make sense to you. A long beat. But I'm sitting down now and I'm not leaving. Ethan lay on the concrete in the dark. He wasn't breathing. The rusted pipe was in his hand and the card was in his pocket and his whole body was coiled and ready, and there was no tactical reason to move, no logical reason to trust any of this. No evidence in 18 years of being alive that this was the kind of thing that happened to people like him. And yet, he stood up. He walked to the stairs, and for the first time in 3 days, Ethan Cole moved towards something instead of away. The stairs took 12 steps to descend, and Ethan counted every single one of them, not because he was stalling, because counting was the thing his mind did when his body was doing something his survival instincts were screaming against. 12 steps between the concrete floor where he'd been lying and the street door at the bottom. 12 steps between running and whatever came next. His hand was tight around the rusted pipe, and he didn't let go of it, not because he planned to use it, but because it was the only thing in the world right now that belonged entirely to him. He pushed the door open. Victor Ryder was sitting on the curb exactly where he said he'd be. No weapon visible, no other riders. Just a man in his 50s with a leather vest and silver in his beard sitting on a curb in the middle of the night, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, forearms resting on his knees looking at the ground. He looked up when Ethan came out. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Ethan stood in the doorway with the pipe at his side and looked at Victor the way you looked at something you needed to assess quickly and completely cataloging exits, reading body language, measuring the distance between them and what it would cost to close it or widen it. Victor looked at Ethan the way you looked at something fragile that you had been searching for a long time and were terrified to touch wrong. You look worse than you did at the gas station, Victor said. I've had a rough couple of days, Ethan said. Someone's been chasing me. Victor absorbed that, didn't flinch from it. That's fair, he said. I'm sorry for how it looked. How did you expect it to look? 50 bikers with my picture pinned all over the south end. I didn't think it through from your side. Victor said it plainly without defensive inflation. Just a fact he was willing to own. I knew what I meant. I didn't stop to think about what you'd see. He paused. That was a failure of imagination on my part. I'm telling you that directly. Ethan studied him. He was looking for the angle, the manipulation, the setup, the thing underneath the thing. He was very good at finding those. He'd been reading the subtext of adult behavior since he was 6 years old and understanding slowly and painfully that what people said and what they meant were frequently two entirely different things. He couldn't find it. That was almost more unsettling than finding it would have been. What do you actually want from me? Ethan asked. Nothing, Victor said. I want to say thank you. I want to make sure you're not hurt. And I want to ask you, and this is a question, not a demand. I need you to understand the difference. I want to ask you if there's anything I can do for you. Silence. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something. The sound of the city at 3 a.m, thin and distant and uninvested in the drama of any individual human life. You don't owe me anything, Ethan said. No, Victor agreed. I don't owe you. This isn't about owing. He looked up at Ethan with an expression that had moved past formality into something more difficult and more honest. My daughter is alive because of you. And I've been running this city for 22 years, and I've seen a lot of things, and I know what it means when a person acts without thinking about the cost to themselves. That's not nothing. That's the rarest thing there is." He paused. "So, no, I don't owe you. I needed to find you. I needed you to know it mattered." Ethan's grip on the pipe loosened slightly. He wasn't aware of it. "She okay?" he asked, quieter. "Hairline fracture in her collarbone. She'll be fine." Victor's voice shifted fractionally when he talked about Ava, just a degree or two of warmth that he didn't fully control. "She's been asking about you since she woke up. Drove the nursing staff halfway to madness. Despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the bruised knee and the suspicion that was still very much present." Ethan felt the corner of his mouth move, just slightly. Victor saw it. He didn't comment on it. He just stood up slowly from the curb, and when he was standing, he was very large in the way Ethan had registered at the gas station, but the largeness felt different out here in the dark with no other people around. Less like a threat and more like a fact. "Come back with me," Victor said. "Not to the clubhouse. Somewhere neutral. There's a diner on Clement Street that's open all night. We sit, we eat, you let someone look at that shoulder, and if at any point you want to leave, you leave, and I won't stop you, and I won't follow." He held Ethan's gaze. "You have my word." "Your word," Ethan said, not mocking, testing the sound of it. "I understand that means nothing to you yet," Victor said. "That's okay. You don't have to trust me. You just have to decide if you're hungry enough to sit across from me for an hour." Ethan was absolutely hungry enough. He hadn't eaten in close to 30 hours. He looked at the pipe in his hand, then he set it against the door frame and walked toward Victor's motorcycle. The diner on Clement Street smelled like coffee and bacon grease and the specific comfort of a place that had been feeding people through the worst hours of their nights for 30 years without asking too many questions. The woman behind the counter took one look at them, Ethan with his torn jacket and bruised face, Victor with his president patch, and poured 2 coffees without being asked, and brought a first aid kit from under the counter without being told, and then went back to her business with the professionalism of someone who understood that some things were not hers to know. Victor sat across from Ethan and watched him wrap both hands around the coffee cup and said nothing until Ethan had taken 3 sips. Then he said, "Tell me about yourself." Ethan looked at him over the rim of the cup. "Why, because I want to know. People who want to know things usually want to use them. Sometimes," Victor said, "and sometimes they just want to know." He waited. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but I'm going to be honest with you, and you already know some of it. I have people who find information, and what they found about Ethan Cole made me sit in my daughter's hospital room last night and feel like I'd swallowed something sharp." Ethan went still. "What did they find?" 4 different foster placements between age 6 and 14. 2 of them with substantiated abuse complaints filed after you left. 1 group home that was shut down for neglect 2 years after you cycled through it. Victor said each item without drama, without looking away. "Aged out at 17, no support, no housing, no follow-up from the state, living rough since then." A pause. "That's what they found." Ethan's jaw was tight. Not from anger, from the specific discomfort of having the architecture of your worst years laid out plainly by someone else. It was one thing to live it. It was another to hear it listed. "You had people investigate me," he said. "Yes." "While you were having me hunted through the city." "Yes." Victor didn't soften it. "I needed to understand who you were. I needed to know if I was—" He stopped, started again. "I needed to know if what I was feeling made sense." "What were you feeling?" The question came out more direct than Ethan intended. Victor answered it the same way. "Responsible," he said, "which I know I have no logical reason to feel. You were on the street long before my daughter went into that river. The system failed you long before I ever knew your name." He wrapped his hands around his own cup. "But you pulled her out of that water, and then you ran from me for 3 days, and the whole time you were running, I kept thinking this kid has been running his whole life, and nobody has ever tried to make him stop." The diner was quiet around them. The woman behind the counter was reading something. The coffee was getting into Ethan's blood and waking up parts of him that had gone numb in the last 48 hours. "I don't need saving," Ethan said. "I know that," Victor said immediately. "You've been saving yourself for years. You're clearly very good at it. He looked at Ethan steadily. But being good at surviving alone doesn't mean you have to keep doing it alone. Ethan looked down at the table. The thing Victor had just said landed in him in a place he couldn't defend because he hadn't thought to armor it. He'd spent so much energy on the practical armoring, the exits, the angles, the reads, the runs, that the thing underneath it all had stayed swamped by default untouched because no one had ever gotten close enough to reach it. What are you actually offering? Ethan asked. His voice was careful, controlled, but underneath it something was listening very hard. Tonight, food, a safe place to sleep, and someone to look at that shoulder. Victor paused. After tonight, that's a conversation for after tonight. I don't want to put more on the table than you're ready to look at. Ethan nodded slowly. That was the right answer. It was such a precise calibration of the right answer that it made him suspicious all over again. And then he looked at Victor's face, at the lines in it, at the steadiness of it, at the thing in his eyes that looked less like calculation and more like a man keeping himself from saying too much because he knew exactly how much was too much, and the suspicion softened by 1 degree. 1 degree, not more, but 1 degree was more than 0. The food came without them ordering it, plates of eggs and toast and bacon and hash browns, the kind of meal that said someone had called ahead. Ethan looked at it and then looked at Victor. You called from the road, Ethan said. I thought you might be hungry. You were that sure I'd come out? Victor shook his head. I wasn't sure at all. I just thought if he comes out, he should have something warm waiting. He picked up his fork. And if he doesn't, I'll eat it myself and try again tomorrow. Something cracked open in Ethan's chest, just slightly. Just a hairline fracture like Ava's collarbone, the kind that hurt precisely because the thing breaking was something that had been held rigid for too long. He picked up his fork and ate. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the heavy things, mostly. Victor asked questions that were careful and specific without being invasive. What kind of work Ethan had been picking up, which parts of the city he knew best, whether he had any documents on him, whether his hand was healing. Practical questions, the kind that had answers, not the kind that required excavation. Ethan answered them, briefly at first, then with slightly more weight, then without consciously deciding to with actual honesty. The way you talked when your body was warm for the first time in days and the coffee was strong and the person across from you kept asking the next question in a way that made it feel safe to answer the current one. At one point, Victor said, Did you ever finish school? Ethan said 9th grade. Then the placement changed and the new school never processed my enrollment paperwork, and by the time anyone noticed, 6 months had passed. Victor set his fork down. 6 months. It happened more than once. Victor said nothing for a moment. His jaw did the same thing it had done on the phone call about Dale Pruitt, that small, controlled tightening of the muscle. Ethan was starting to understand that was what it looked like when Victor Ryder was furious and choosing not to express it. You're smart, Victor said. Anyone who's talked to you for 10 minutes knows that. Doesn't matter much without a diploma. It matters more than you think. A pause. It can be fixed, the diploma, the paperwork, all of it. These things feel permanent, but they're not. Ethan looked at him. You're talking about things that cost money and take time and require someone to advocate for you through a system that already failed you once. Yes, Victor said, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And you're what volunteering for that. Victor met his eyes. I'm saying it's possible and that you don't have to figure out how to do it alone if you don't want to. He held up a hand, slightly preempting the defensiveness he could see forming in Ethan's posture. Not a debt, not an obligation, not a chain. You walk out of here tonight the same free person you walked in as. I'm just telling you what's possible. They sat with that. Outside, the first pale suggestion of morning was starting somewhere beyond the buildings. Ethan thought about the textile building, the cold concrete, the pipe, the 3 days of running through a city that had been full of people looking for him and had somehow still felt completely empty. Then he thought about sitting at this table, the coffee, the eggs, the man across from him who had found every angle to push and had pushed exactly none of them. Your daughter, Ethan said. She said she wanted to see me. Victor's expression shifted very slightly, very carefully in the direction of something that might have been relief if you knew how to read it. She did. She's still at the hospital. Until tomorrow, then she comes home. He paused. She will absolutely not let this go until she sees you herself. I want you to understand that about her. Ava does not let things go. I noticed, Ethan said. Victor almost smiled. It was brief and quickly controlled, but it was real. She gets that from her mother. A beat of silence softer than the ones before it. Okay, Ethan said. Victor looked at him. Okay, what? Okay, I'll come. Ethan said it like it cost him something because it did. To see Ava before she goes home. He paused. Not the clubhouse. Not yet. Just the hospital. Just the hospital. Victor agreed immediately. And I'm not making any other decisions tonight. No other decisions tonight. Ethan nodded, looked down at his plate, looked back up. Why do you care this much? Really? Past the gratitude, past the thank you. He held Victor's gaze directly. Why does it feel like this is about more than what I did? Victor was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Ethan thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, I had a son. The air in the diner changed. He died, Victor said, flat and simple and carrying approximately the weight of a building. 7 years ago, he was 20. A pause. Motorcycle accident, not here, out of state. He was alone when it happened, and nobody found him for 6 hours. His hands were still around his cup, completely still. He was a good kid, better than I deserved probably. And I spent a lot of years after that thinking about all the things I would have done differently. He looked at Ethan. And then I drove to that gas station and I looked at you under those lights, soaking wet, cut hand, wouldn't take the card for 30 seconds because you didn't trust free things and something in me just... He stopped. Recognize something, Ethan said quietly. Victor looked at him for a moment. Something moved across his face that he didn't try to control. Yeah, he said, recognize something. The silence between them was different now, not the silence of two strangers negotiating. The silence of two people who had arrived by very different roads at the same specific kind of loneliness. The woman behind the counter refilled their coffees without being asked. Neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. Then Ethan said in a voice that was so quiet it barely made it across the table. I didn't know why I jumped. That night at the river. I've been trying to figure it out since it happened. He looked at his hands. I think I knew what it felt like to be somewhere nobody could see you. And I didn't want her to be there alone. Victor Ryder, a man who had been president of the most feared motorcycle club in Montana for 22 years, who had negotiated with people who wanted him dead, who had buried friends and faced down law enforcement, and never once in any of it shown the inside of himself to anyone, pressed his lips together and looked at the surface of his coffee. She wasn't alone, he said. His voice was slightly rougher than it had been. Because of you. Ethan nodded, Victor nodded. And somewhere in the silence that followed, in the warmth of that diner at 4 a.m, with the coffee and the empty plates and the dawn pressing at the edges of the windows, something shifted between them that neither of them had words for yet. Not family. It was too early for that word, too large, too loaded with everything Ethan didn't know how to hold. But not strangers either. Something in between. Something new. Something that had no name yet but had weight. Real weight, the kind you could feel pressing down on both sides of the table, like a thing that had decided to exist and was not going to undecide. Victor paid the check. He didn't make a thing of it. He just put cash on the table and stood up and picked up his jacket and said, There's a room at a place on 5th Street, clean private week, paid up front. Keys behind the front desk under the name Cole. He looked at Ethan steadily. No obligation, just somewhere to sleep that isn't concrete. Ethan stood up. You set that up already. Before I came to find you. That's either very confident or very presumptuous. It's neither, Victor said. It's just what you do when you decide that a person matters. He held out his hand. Get some sleep, Ethan. I'll pick you up at 10 for the hospital. Ethan looked at the hand, looked at Victor's face, looked at the door. Then he reached out and shook it. Victor's grip was firm and brief and did not try to be more than what it was. He nodded once, turned and walked out. Ethan stood at the table for a moment after he was gone. The woman behind the counter looked up from her book and said without any particular inflection, Honey, whatever that man is offering you, I've been watching people come and go in this diner for 20 years, and I can read an honest face. She looked back down. Take it. Ethan picked up his jacket, walked out into the beginning of morning. And for the first time in 3 days, for the first time in a long time, if he was honest, he was walking somewhere instead of away from something. The room on Fifth Street had a real bed, a real pillow, a lock on the door that he could control from the inside. He sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the ceiling and understood with the particular clarity that came from total exhaustion, meeting something unfamiliar, that his life had just turned a corner so sharp that he couldn't see what was on the other side of it. He wasn't sure if that was terrifying or the best thing that had ever happened to him. Probably he thought it was both. He slept for 11 hours straight. No dreams, no waking at every sound, no calculating the nearest exit in the dark. Just 11 hours of the deepest, most complete unconsciousness Ethan Cole had experienced in years. The kind of sleep that only comes when some part of your body decides against all the evidence of your history that it is temporarily safe to let go. He woke up at 9:15 to the sound of traffic on Fifth Street and lay still for a full minute before he remembered where he was. Real ceiling, real pillow. Lock on the door that he had checked 3 times before lying down. The room was small and the carpet was old, but it was warm and it was private and nobody had come through the door in the night, which meant that the room was by every measure that actually mattered to Ethan Cole perfect. He sat up, ran his hands over his face, looked at the cut on his right hand, which someone at the diner he hadn't even fully registered it happening. He'd been so focused on Victor, had cleaned and wrapped in a proper bandage while he was eating. His shoulder ached from the fence. His knee was stiff. But the fever edge he'd felt in the textile building was gone, burned out somewhere in those 11 hours of sleep. He had 45 minutes before Victor said he'd pick him up. He used them to shower, standing under hot water for longer than he had any right to, because the room had hot water, and he was not going to pretend that wasn't extraordinary, and to examine very carefully and privately the decision he had made in the early hours of the morning. He had shaken Victor Ryder's hand. He had accepted the room, accepted the plan, agreed to go to the hospital. None of those things could be undaked. They were in the past, now settled, and what Ethan had learned from years of living on the edge of other people's decisions was that the past was the only thing that was ever truly solid. You could trust what had already happened because it couldn't be rearranged. Everything forward was still a variable. The question was whether he could trust the variable. He thought about what Victor had said, about his son, about recognition, about the particular weight of a man who had built everything he had around protecting the people he loved and then lost one anyway, and had been carrying that specific failure ever since. Ethan understood carrying things. He got dressed in the same clothes because they were the only clothes he had, and at exactly 10 o'clock there was a knock on the door, not a pounding, not an announcement, just 2 quiet knocks, and he opened it. Victor was in the hallway, no vest this time, just jeans and a plain dark jacket, which made him look simultaneously more ordinary and more like himself, as if the removal of the armor revealed something more solid underneath. He looked at Ethan and nodded once, in the way that had already become in less than 24 hours a kind of language between them. "You sleep?" Victor asked. "Yeah, good." He didn't make more of it than that. Didn't comment on the 11 hours or the shower or the look of someone who had come back slightly from wherever they'd been. Just good. As if Ethan sleeping was the only outcome that made sense, and it had happened, and now they could move forward. Cars out front, Manny's driving. Ethan followed him down. The hospital smelled like every hospital antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular tension of a building where people were either getting better or not. Manny, who turned out to be a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a shaved head, and the careful movements of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as he needed and no more stayed with the car. Victor walked Ethan through the lobby and into the elevator without exchanging more than 12 words with the staff, all of whom nodded at him with the deference of people who understood that this was not a man you made wait. On the 3rd floor outside room 314, Victor stopped. "She's going to talk a lot," he said. "I'm telling you now so it doesn't catch you off guard." "Okay," Ethan said. "She's been awake since 6. She's already reorganized the get well flowers twice and argued with 2 nurses about the discharge timeline." A pause. "She does not handle stillness well." "I noticed." Victor pushed the door open. Ava was sitting upright in the hospital bed with her left arm in a sling. Her blonde hair pulled back, wearing an expression that made it immediately clear she had been waiting and had opinions about how long it had taken. She was also Ethan registered in the first second, more fully herself in daylight than she had seemed at the gas station, sharper, more present, more completely the person she apparently was when she wasn't half drowned and in shock. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "You look terrible." "You have a broken collarbone," Ethan said. "Hairline fracture. There's a difference." She gestured at the chair beside her bed with her good arm. "Sit down. I have things to say." Victor made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh and went to stand by the window with the practiced body language of a man removing himself from the center of something without leaving the room. Ethan sat. Ava looked at him with the directness that seemed to be her default setting. Not rude, just honest, the kind of honesty that didn't occur to most people as an option. "I've been thinking about you since I woke up in this room," she said. "And not in a weird way. You jumped into a freezing river to pull out a stranger, and then you ran from everyone trying to thank you, which is the most simultaneously heroic and ridiculous thing I've ever heard of, and I needed to look at you in person and make sure you were real." "I'm real," Ethan said. "Apparently." She studied his face. "Are you okay?" "Actually okay, not okay like you say to people who don't actually know what they're asking." He thought about it, because she'd asked it like she wanted the real answer. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm better than yesterday, still figuring out the rest." She nodded. "That's honest." A beat. "My dad told me what he found out, about your history." She held up her good hand before he could react. "I'm not going to say I'm sorry because you look like someone who's had enough of that. I just want you to know that I know, and it changes the way I understand what you did." Ethan went carefully still. "What do you mean, Dean?" "I mean, most people jump in to save someone because they believe somebody will pull them out too. It's unconscious you risk your life because life feels like something the world will protect." She looked at him steadily. "You jumped in knowing the world doesn't work that way for you, knowing that if something went wrong, there was nobody on that bank who would have come in after you." She paused. "That's a different thing. That's a much bigger thing." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Nobody had ever framed it that way. He hadn't framed it that way himself. And hearing it said out loud accurately and without embellishment did something to his chest that he didn't have clean language for. "I didn't think about it like that," he said. "I know, that's what makes it real." She leaned back slightly. "I'm glad you came today. I was afraid my dad might have done too much too fast and scared you off." Behind her by the window, Victor said nothing, but his shoulders moved in a way that suggested he was listening to every word. Ethan started, stopped, tried again. "He's different than I expected." "He's different than most people expect," Ava said. "He's also the most stubborn human being on earth, and once he decides something matters to him, you cannot move him off it with a crane." She glanced at her father. "Right now, you matter to him. I want you to understand what that means in practical terms." "Ava," Victor's voice from the window, a single word, a single note of caution. "He needs to know Dad." She looked back at Ethan. "It means he's going to try to help you whether you want it or not. It means you're going to have to be honest with him about what you actually need because he'll fill the vacuum with what he thinks you need and he's not always right. And it means," she paused and something in her voice went quieter, more careful. "It means he's going to get attached. He's already attached. I can tell." She held Ethan's gaze. "He lost someone. You probably know that by now. And I'm not saying you owe him anything because of that. You don't. But I am saying be careful with him, not for his sake, for both of yours." The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at Ava, at the directness of her, at the way she had just navigated something enormously complex with the precision of someone who loved her father completely and knew his damage exactly, and he understood something he hadn't until this moment. She wasn't just Victor's daughter. She was Victor's anchor. Had been for 7 years. And she was now in her careful and unsentimentally kind way, asking Ethan to be careful with something she'd spent 7 years helping hold together. "I hear you," he said. She studied him for another moment. Then she said, "Okay." And he could feel that she meant it, that she'd assessed him and found something in his answer that satisfied whatever questions she'd actually been asking. "Good," she said. "Now, are you going to let my dad help you or are you going to make this harder than it needs to be?" Ethan glanced at Victor. Victor's expression was completely neutral, in the way of a man pretending he isn't intensely invested in the answer. I don't know how to do this, Ethan said. He said it to both of them, but mostly to himself. I know how to manage on my own. I know how to read situations and stay safe and not need things. I don't have a template for this. Nobody does, Ava said simply. You just start. You let one thing be okay, and then you see what the next thing is. She tilted her head slightly. You jumped into a river on pure instinct, and it was the right call. Maybe try that approach. He almost smiled. That approach nearly killed me. But it didn't. She held his gaze. You're here. He was here. That was true. Undeniably and arguably actually true. Victor crossed the room then and pulled the other chair up and sat down, and the three of them existed in that hospital room together for the next 2 hours in a way that was neither perfectly comfortable nor perfectly awkward, but something more sustainable than either, something that felt cautiously and tentatively like the earliest possible version of something real. Victor laid it out plainly, not as demands, not as charity, but as a series of concrete options that Ethan could take or leave. The room on Fifth Street was available for as long as he needed it. There was work available, legitimate work, mechanical and logistical, the kind of skilled physical labor that the club's various legal operations required if he wanted it. There was a contact at the city school board, someone who owed Victor a conversation, who could look at the paperwork gap and see what was salvageable toward a GED. And there was simply an open door at the clubhouse. Not an obligation, not an induction, just a door. Ethan listened to all of it, then he said, the work, yes. The room for now, yes. The school. He paused, and the pause was long enough that Victor and Ava both let it be what it was. Maybe. I need to think about that one. Take your time, Victor said. The clubhouse. Ethan stopped again, looked at the table. I'm not ready for that. Okay, Victor said. No push, no negotiation. But Ethan looked up. I'm not saying no to everything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying no to everything. Victor nodded. The muscle in his jaw did not tighten. His hands stayed still. Everything in his posture said that he understood the difference between not yet and never, and that he was willing to stand at the border of not yet for as long as it took. Then we start there, Victor said. Work and the room. Everything else at whatever pace you set. They shook hands again. More natural this time. Less like two people measuring each other and more like two people who had already measured each other and arrived at a provisional conclusion. What came after that was not a clean transformation. It never is for anyone, and the story would be dishonest if it pretended otherwise. The first week was careful and strange. Ethan showed up at the garage on Meridian Street that one of the club's senior members ran as a legitimate auto shop, and he discovered that 4 years of dock work and survival maintenance had given him a functional understanding of engines that nobody had ever bothered to formalize. He worked quietly, spoke little, made no errors, and at the end of the first day, the shop manager, a tattooed man named Hicks, who communicated largely through grunts and eyebrow movements, told him to come back tomorrow. That was it. That was the whole review. He went back the next day, and the next, and the one after that. The men at the garage were for the first week carefully neutral, not unfriendly, not welcoming, just neutral in the professional way of people who understood that a new person needed time to prove what kind of new person they were going to be. Ethan respected that completely. He understood the logic of it. He was doing the same assessment from his side. By the end of week 2, a man named Diggs had started talking to him about engines in the specific, generous way of someone who actually loved the subject and was relieved to have found an audience. By week 3, Hicks had started leaving him the more complex jobs without instructions, which Ethan understood was a form of compliment. By the end of the month, the neutral had warmed by degrees into something that felt carefully and without announcement, like acceptance. The first time someone at the garage called him Cole instead of the kid, Ethan was elbow deep in a transmission and didn't react for 3 full seconds because he was processing the shift. Cole, hand me that socket wrench. He handed it over without a word, but something in his chest registered it. Ava came home from his hospital, and the distance between them and Ethan did not increase the way he had half expected it to. She texted him Victor had given him a phone, a plain, prepaid one, matter of fact, and without ceremony, with a frequency that was somewhere between friendly and relentless. Observations about things she was reading, questions about the garage. Once a long string of messages about a documentary she'd watched about the foster care system that she prefaced with, "I'm not bringing this up to make you feel observed. I'm bringing it up because it made me furious on your behalf, and I needed to tell someone." He had stared at that message for a long time. Then he'd typed back, "How furious," and she'd sent back a string of words that made him actually laugh alone in his room at 10 o'clock at night, a sound so unfamiliar in that space that it almost surprised him. He saved that text. It was surprise. He wasn't fully sure why. The first time he went to the clubhouse was a Thursday evening, 5 weeks after the night at the diner. Ava had been there when Victor asked, not pushing, just present, letting him know she'd be there too, and Ethan had thought about it for 24 hours before saying yes. "Just dinner," Victor had said. "Guys from the garage will be there. You know most of them already." He walked in expecting to feel like an intrusion. What he felt instead was the specific social texture of a room full of people who already knew who he was and had decided collectively and without announcement to treat him like someone who belonged there. Not with ceremony or performance, just naturally, the way you treated someone who was already part of the fabric. Diggs handed him a plate. Hicks moved over on the bench to make room without being asked. A man he didn't know called him Cole and asked what he thought about the carburetor issue on the 72 Chevelle they'd been arguing about all week. He sat down and ate and talked about the Chevelle, and nobody made him feel like a guest. Halfway through dinner, Victor sat down across from him, not at the head of the table, just across like a regular person, and said quietly enough that it was between them, "How you doing?" Ethan looked around the room, at Diggs gesturing with a chicken wing, at Hicks losing an argument with a man twice his size about ignition timing, at Ava across the room talking to one of the older members' wives with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up in exactly this noise and loved it. "I don't know what this is yet," Ethan said honestly, "but it doesn't feel bad." Victor nodded. "That's enough." "Is it for tonight?" Victor said. "Yeah, for tonight, that's everything." Ethan turned back to his food. And something in him, some specific load-bearing thing that had been locked in place since approximately age 6 shifted, not broke, not dissolved, just shifted like a door moving a quarter inch on a hinge that had been frozen for too long. Opening not all the way, not even halfway, but opening. The trouble when it came from outside. It always did. 3 weeks after that dinner, a story ran in the city paper. Small item back pages, the kind of filler piece that ran when the real news was slow. Hell's Angels president employs homeless teen who saved daughter. The details were incomplete and the framing was everything the paper's readership expected. Suspicious, slightly sensationalized, implying something transactional that wasn't there. Ethan didn't see it first. He found out when he arrived at the garage on a Tuesday morning, and Hicks met him at the door with an expression that was readable, which meant it was serious, because Hicks had a face designed by nature for inscrutability. "You seen the paper," Hicks said. "No." Hicks handed him his phone. Ethan read it in 40 seconds. Read it again more slowly. 3 things happened simultaneously in his chest. Anger because the framing was dishonest, and he'd spent his whole life having a situation framed by people who had no accurate information. Fear because attention meant exposure, and exposure had never once been good for him. And a third thing, smaller, quieter, more complicated, that was something like the sensation of understanding that what he'd been trying to build these past weeks had just become visible to the world. Invisible things could be taken away. He handed the phone back. "Victor, no," he asked. "Called you 15 minutes ago. Went to voicemail." Ethan checked the prepaid. Missed call, Victor. And below it, a text from Ava. "Don't spiral, call my dad." He stood there in the doorway of the garage with the morning cold coming in behind him and made himself breathe through the response his body wanted to have. The old response, the running response, the get small and invisible response that had kept him alive for years and was now possibly no longer the right tool for the situation. He called Victor. Victor picked up on the first ring. "I saw it," Ethan said. "I know, I'm sorry. One of the guys at the paper, we have a history, and this is him taking a shot at me through you. This is not about you." Victor's voice was calm and certain in a way that Ethan was starting to understand was not performance but constitution. Victor Ryder simply did not rattle, and when he said something was handled, it was because he had already begun handling it. "I'm dealing with it today. It won't run again." It's already out. Yes, it is. A pause. Are you okay? Ethan thought about lying, chose not to. I don't like being visible. I know. Victor's voice shifted, not softer exactly, but more direct, the way it got when he was saying the thing he actually meant instead of the approach to it. Ethan, listen to me. You've been managing your own exposure for years because exposure meant vulnerability. I understand that. But you're not as alone in this as you used to be. People see that article and want to make something ugly out of it. They're going to have to go through me first. That's not a threat. That's just the math. Ethan stood in the doorway and said nothing for a moment. Then, the article says, I'm working for you. You are working for me. It makes it sound like, I know what it sounds like. The people who know you know the truth. The people who don't, their opinion is not the thing we're protecting here. Victor paused. Come to the house tonight. We'll figure out the next steps together. You don't have to manage this alone. You don't have to manage this alone. He had heard that sentence in various forms 3 times in the past month, and every single time it landed in him like something true that his body was still learning whether to believe. Okay, Ethan said. He went into the garage and he worked all day and he did not spiral. And that specific act of staying, instead of running, of choosing the room over the road, was quietly without fanfare the bravest thing Ethan Cole had done since the night he went over the railing into the Yellowstone River. Maybe braver, because that night at the river he hadn't thought about the cost. This time he knew exactly what it cost to stay. And he stayed anyway. The newspaper article did not go away quietly. Victor had said he would handle it, and he did handle it. The paper ran a correction. The journalist responsible found his access to certain events and venues suddenly and inexplicably limited, but the damage that mattered wasn't the kind that corrections fixed. The damage was that the story had given people a frame. And once a city has a frame for something, it uses it whether the frame fits or not. What the frame said was this: Victor Ryder, the most powerful man in Montana's criminal landscape, had taken in a homeless teenager. And the reasons for that were probably not what they appeared to be. Ethan heard versions of this everywhere. Not said to his face, nobody said things to your face when you worked at a garage where Hells Angels members came and went, but in the way certain conversations stopped when he walked into a room. In the way the woman at the corner store looked at him after the article ran slightly different than before the particular look of someone who had updated their mental file. In the way a man he'd never met stopped him outside the garage one afternoon and said with a synthetic concern of someone performing morality, Son, you know, you don't have to be involved with these people if you feel like you're in over your head. There are resources. I know what resources are, Ethan said. His voice was flat. I used them for 4 years. They didn't work. The man blinked, started to say something else. I'm not in over my head, Ethan said. I'm at work. Have a good afternoon. He went back inside. But it saddened him. Not what the man had said that was noise easily categorized and filed. What saddened him was the awareness that his life, which he had managed carefully and privately for years, was now visible. Visible to strangers who didn't know the story. Visible to people who would reduce it to a headline. Visible in a way that felt on the bad days like standing in a room where the walls had disappeared. He told Ava about the man outside the garage. They were in the clubhouse kitchen on a Saturday afternoon. She was eating cereal at 2:10 in the afternoon, which she did without apology, and he'd already accepted as a personal characteristic. And he told her what the man had said and how he'd responded, and she listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. When he finished, she said, How did it make you feel, not the man? How did it feel to push back? He thought about it. Weird, good weird, like he searched for it. Like I had ground under my feet. She nodded. That's what it feels like when you stop apologizing for existing. She looked at him directly. You've been doing that more, not apologizing. Is that good? It's necessary, she said. There's a difference in yes. He sat with that. She put her cereal bowl in the sink and turned around and looked at him with the expression she got when she was about to say something that required her to choose her words carefully. My dad is going to ask you something. Probably tonight. I'm not going to tell you what it is because it should come from him. But I wanted you to know it's coming so your first instinct isn't to deflect. Ethan looked at her. You're telling me not to deflect before I know what the thing is. Your default move is deflection. You do it when things matter too much to risk a straight answer. She held his gaze. This one matters too much to deflect. He didn't ask her what it was. She'd said it should come from Victor, and he believed her, and there was something in her voice that told him arguing was not the right move here. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated. And then in a completely different tone, like they had not just had that conversation at all. Do you want some cereal? It's 2 in the afternoon. Cereal doesn't have a time. He got a bowl. Victor asked him that evening. They were in the garage at the clubhouse, not the commercial shop on Meridian, but the personal garage at the back of the property where Victor worked on his own bikes. The one where Ethan had started showing up on weekend afternoons because working with his hands was still the easiest way he knew to be in a room with someone without the conversation needing to carry all the weight. Victor was on his back under a '68 shovelhead that had a timing problem they'd been arguing about for 2 weeks. Ethan was at the workbench cataloging a parts order. They'd been quiet for 20 minutes in the comfortable way they developed, the way that didn't require maintenance. Victor rolled out from under the bike, sat up, looked at his hands for a moment the way he did when he was organizing what he wanted to say. Then he said, I want to talk to you about something, and I need you to hear it all the way through before you respond. Ethan set down the clipboard. Okay. The GED program, I talked to the contact at the school board. It's possible, fully possible. Your paperwork can be reconstructed. It takes about 6 months. You test at the end. It's done. Victor looked at him steadily. But that's not the thing I want to ask you. Ethan waited. I had a conversation with a lawyer 2 weeks ago, Victor said, about a specific legal process, one that I want to explain to you, and I want you to understand that this is not pressure. This is a door. You can walk through it or you can close it, and I will never bring it up again. He paused. There is a legal pathway to adult guardianship for young adults who age out of the foster system without family placement. It's not standard. It requires petitioning. It requires someone to stand up in front of a judge and say, this person belongs to me. Not owned, belongs, the way family does. Victor's voice was steady and his eyes were steady, and the only thing that gave away what this was costing him to say was the very slight roughness at the edges of certain words. I want to be that person, if you'll let me. Silence. The garage held it. Ethan stood at the workbench and did not move, and the world did what it did when something enormous happened. It kept going. The traffic outside kept moving somewhere in the clubhouse. Someone was laughing at something. The fluorescent light above the workbench hummed its ordinary hum, and inside all of that ordinary continuation, Ethan Cole stood very still and felt the ground rearrange itself under him. He stopped. His voice had done something he didn't authorize. He started again. That's a legal document. That's permanent. Yes, Victor said. You've known me for 3 months. I know. Victor didn't look away. I know that's not a long time. I know you have every reason to be skeptical of permanent things. I know the word family has been used to mean something completely different to you than what it actually means. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees. But I also know what I've seen in 3 months. And I know that what I feel when I look at you is not an impulse. It's a conclusion. Ethan's hands were at his sides. He could feel his own heartbeat. What about your club, he said. His voice was careful and very quiet. The men, some of them I haven't earned. I didn't ask them, Victor said. This isn't a club decision. This is mine. A pause. But I'll tell you what will happen if you say yes. Half of them will take it in stride because they've watched you work for 3 months and they already know what you are. The other half will get there. He held Ethan's gaze. Nobody in that clubhouse has a vote on who I call my son. The word landed in the room like something physical. Son. Ethan had to look away. He looked at the wall for a moment, at the pegboard with the tools hung in order, at the clean lines of a space that was organized by a man who understood that a well-ordered external world was a way of managing an internal one. And he breathed. You had a son, Ethan said, still looking at the wall. I did, Victor said quietly. I'm not him. No, Victor's voice was steady and certain. You are not him. You are Ethan Cole, and you are completely yourself, and I am not asking you to be anything else. A beat. I lost Danny. I will carry that for the rest of my life. But grief is not a reason to stop living, and it is not a reason to leave a door closed when someone is standing on the other side of it. Ethan turned back. Victor was watching him with the patience of a man who had decided to wait and meant it, who would sit in that garage for hours, for days, for however long the answer needed to take. I don't know how to do this, Ethan said, the same thing he'd said to Victor and Ava in the hospital room. But it meant something different now, bigger, more specific. Neither do I, Victor said. Not with you, not in this exact configuration. He almost smiled. We'll figure it out. Ethan looked at him, at the lines in his face, at the steadiness in him, at the man who had sent 50 bikers to find him not for revenge, but for gratitude, who had sat on a curb in the middle of the night and waited, who had said, you don't have to manage this alone, and had then proven day by day that he meant it. He thought about the textile building, the concrete, the rusted pipe, the 3 days of running from something that turned out to be the opposite of what he'd feared. He thought about 11 hours of sleep in a room with a lock he controlled. He thought about Diggs in the chicken wing and Hicks moving over on the bench. He thought about Ava and 2 o'clock cereal, and it's necessary, there's a difference, and yes, he thought about the water, the Black River, the girl he'd pulled out without thinking because he understood what it meant to be somewhere nobody could see you, and he hadn't been able to leave her there alone. And he thought about the thing he had wanted in the quiet of the textile building when he had finally let himself be honest about it. Someone to tell him it was okay to stop running. Yes, Ethan said. The word was quiet, just one syllable, just one small sound in a garage with a fluorescent hum and a 68 shovel head with a timing problem and 40 years of accumulated weight on both sides of a single moment. Victor stood up. He crossed the distance between them and did what he had done in the warehouse in the original version of this story that the city would later tell and get mostly wrong. He put his hand on Ethan's shoulder. Not a grip, not a grab, just a hand. Present, solid, real. Okay, Victor said. His voice had gone rough in the way it went when he was controlling something that didn't want to be controlled. Okay. They stood like that for a moment. Not an embrace that would come later slowly in the way that all true things between people with complicated histories came slowly. But the hand on the shoulder and the word okay and the standing together in the space after the yes, that was enough. For that moment, that was everything. The charity event happened 6 weeks later. It was an annual thing, the club's public event, the one where they presented donations to 3 or 4 local organizations, and Victor made a brief speech, and the city's relationship with Hell's Angels was permitted for one afternoon to be something other than adversarial. Ethan had known about it. He hadn't planned to be on stage. He'd planned to be in the back, near the exit, close enough to have attended, and far enough from the center not to be the thing people were looking at. That was not what happened. He was standing at the back of the crowd when Victor took the stage and went through the usual business, the donations, the acknowledgments, the brief words. And then Victor paused, looked out at the crowd, found Ethan's face in the back with the particular accuracy of someone who had memorized where a person stood. Most of you saw a story in the paper a few months ago, Victor said. His voice carried without effort, the voice of a man who had been addressing rooms for decades. The story got some things right and a lot of things wrong. I want to take 2 minutes to get it right. The crowd went quiet. This city has a problem. It's not a new problem, and it's not unique to us. The problem is that we have a system that's supposed to protect children, and that system fails more kids than it saves. It failed one in particular. It failed him for 18 years through foster placements in group homes and paperwork that got lost, and a high school enrollment that never happened, and a birthday at 17 where the state handed him a bag of belongings and a pamphlet about adult services and closed the door. Victor looked at the crowd steadily. And then that same kid who the system failed, who this city walked past 100 times, stood on a dock in a storm and heard a scream and didn't think about it. He just went. Complete silence. He pulled my daughter out of that river, Victor said. And then he ran from me for 3 days because his entire history had taught him that when people came looking for you, it was never good. He paused. That's on us, every one of us who has ever walked past a kid sleeping rough and decided it wasn't our problem. That's on this city. A reporter near the front was writing fast. 2 of them had cameras up. Ethan was standing very still at the back of the crowd, and his heart was doing something loud and complicated in his chest. "I'm proud to tell you," Victor said, "that as of 3 weeks ago, Ethan Cole is my son, legally, permanently, in every way that counts." He looked toward the back of the crowd, directly at Ethan, "and he starts his GED program next Monday. And he's the best mechanic we have at Meridian Street, which is saying something because we have some very good mechanics." Laughter moved through the crowd, the kind of laughter that released something. Victor reached behind him, and Crash was there. Crash, who had pulled the riders back the night. Victor went alone. Crash, who had handed Ethan a plate at his first clubhouse dinner without being asked, holding a leather vest. Black, heavy, with a single patch on the back that was not the standard club patch, but something else. Something made specifically. Family, in letters that meant what they said. Victor stepped off the stage, walked through the crowd, which parted for him the way crowds always did, walked to the back where Ethan was standing and stood in front of him and held out the vest without ceremony, because Victor Ryder had never been a man for unnecessary ceremony, and that was one of the things that made him trustworthy. Ethan took it. His hands were not entirely steady. He didn't try to hide that, he put it on. The crowd reporters, police officers, club members, city residents who had come out of curiosity and were now standing in the particular silence of people witnessing something they had not expected to be moved by, was completely quiet for a moment. Then Ava appeared beside her father. She looked at Ethan in the vest, and her expression did the thing it did when she was moved and was not going to pretend she wasn't, which was one of the things about her that was he had come to understand entirely unlike anyone else he had ever known. She walked forward and she put her arms around him carefully, still mindful of the collarbone that had fully healed, but which she treated as a reference point now, and she held on for a moment, and he stood there in the vest with the word family on his back, and his arms came up and he held on too. When she stepped back, she looked at him and said quietly enough that only he could hear it, "Welcome home. You're stuck with us now." And Ethan Cole, who had spent 18 years learning how to need nothing, who had perfected the art of invisible, who had understood survival as a solo operation, conducted in the margins of a world that had consistently declined to notice him, looked at Ava and looked at Victor, and looked at the men from the garage who were standing 10 feet away, with the particular careful dignity of people who were not going to make a big deal about being moved, and he said just as quietly, "I think I'm okay with that." The newspapers the next morning called it a moment, a story, a human interest piece for the ages. They wrote about Victor Ryder and the homeless boy and the daughter and the river and the vest with the family patch. They used words like redemption and unlikely and extraordinary. They missed the point, as newspapers usually did, when they looked at a thing from the outside. The point was not that a feared man had done something kind. The point was not that a homeless boy had been rescued by the right person at the right time. The point was not even the vest or the legal papers or the charity event or the cameras. The point was one night on a dock in a storm. One scream, one boy who had been taught by 18 years of hard living that the world did not come for people like him, and who jumped anyway. Who chose in a fraction of a second to act as though the world were the kind of place where a person's life was worth saving, even a stranger's, even at cost. And the point was that he was right. Not because the world deserved his faith, not because the universe had been watching and rewarded the deserving and the good, but because one single act of genuine human instinct, unthinking, uncalculating pure, had set in motion a chain of consequences that changed every life it touched. Victor Ryder stopped carrying his loss alone. Ava gained a brother who understood in his bones what it meant to hold on. And Ethan Cole, a boy who had spent years running from a city that didn't see him, finally completely and without apology stopped. Not because the running was over, but because he had found something worth staying for. And that, in the end, is the only reason any of us ever do.